With respect to the introduction, the bios can always be a little condensed, and that's fine for time and space. So I'll get into some of my experience, which will feed some of the content that I'm presenting. You may have seen in the advertisement that the topic is winning with a wide world view. Winning with a wide world view. So I'm going to share my screen. I did format it in such a way that it's easy to follow. And I will repeat, as the doctor has mentioned, that the chat is open. And I believe that is the main way for us to proceed in terms of me getting your input or being able to provide some answers to questions you may have. So winning with a wide worldview. So let's speak quickly concerning the learning outcomes. I just need to make sure that my tech is working. Yes, it is. Doctor, can you confirm that the screen share is in order?
It's in order.
Okay, fantastic. So our learning outcome is for us to integrate habits of developing and presenting ideas using a wider perspective, which would demonstrate our contribution to strategy development and strategic outcomes. Now, that's a big mouthful, and it'll become a bit clearer as we go along, as we go through the scenarios. So what I've attempted to do in developing this presentation is to look at the wide world view from all hierarchical perspectives. Obviously, I spend a lot of time dealing with senior leaders, but it's very important for us to take this wide world view and not just assume that that is something for senior leaders. That is actually something that should permeate every stage of your career, even from an academic point of view. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So here is our key message, that cultivating a wide world view is not about demonstrating how much you know. That's a tempting thing. I think we have a lot of situations where we feel that we need to demonstrate that we know things, and we try to address the imposter syndrome by accumulating ever increasing masses of knowledge. But the point of cultivating a wide world view is about maximizing the number of connection cues, call that quote unquote connection cues, you can pick up when engaging with others in virtually any situation. What it does is it enables you to ask more relevant questions, and you increase the chance of receiving open and constructive responses. How many of us have gotten into frustrating communication situations with people where we're just not making any progress because those channels and that level of comfort is just not present? So that's part of what we try to accomplish through having the wide world view. So what we're going to do is look at how this can play out in a variety of scenarios. And importantly, as I pointed out, at any level of an organization's hierarchy. So we're going to speak about it from a business perspective. We'll speak about it a bit from an educational perspective, from a travel perspective. And then we will, at the end, just speak about how we can integrate the aspects of diversity into this conversation. Given the audience, I know that's of central importance. So let's start with the business scenarios. So I'm taking a bit of a top-down approach. I split it up in that way so that we can understand what the different perspectives are and how we can bring value at each level that we are either at or the level that we are interacting with. So sometimes those are two different things. We may not necessarily be board members to be dealing with board members, but it's very important to bring a value-added perspective, even if we're not board members ourselves. So let's get into some of those points. First thing that I advise at the senior level is to start by listening for what is not said in meetings and other informal gatherings. And why do I say this? Because these agendas tend to be relatively well planned and comprehensive. And there's often the false impression that everything is covered, but I can guarantee you that with a little bit of concentration, we would detect that there are some key issues that are not coming up in the conversation. So our value added can very well be by identifying and discovering those items that should be in the conversation but are not. So how do we do that specifically? Well, here's one. We can aim to identify at least one global mega trend that is being overlooked. And why do I speak of global mega trends? Because at the board level, when you're dealing with strategy, you're dealing with existential issues relating to your organization. So you want to know not just what the political landscape is, but you want to know how the world turns, because any aspect of that could have a significant effect on the fundamentals of your business. So if it is possible to identify at least one global megatrend that is being overlooked for your business, and what I usually say is, if you're ignoring the megatrend, you've basically realized the risk. That means that anything that represents a risk to you is actually something that could be a terminal event for your business. So very important to look at global megatrends. And once you're able to identify something that is perhaps a blind spot for your organization, you can demonstrate value almost instantly. Now, maybe it's not just good enough to identify a megatrend. It's important to understand some of the elements that contribute to that trend and how that trend plays out, whether it has to do with data, indicators, or any other effects that you can identify concerning your industry. And the reason why I say industry, again, is because megatrends tend to play out at an industry level. They're generally not specific to your organization, but they affect your organization massively. So research is key. And again, this is not just about demonstrating incredible levels of knowledge. It's supporting your arguments. That's what the research really is for. And we'll see that in the other scenarios as well. And then once you've fleshed it out and you've had some informal conversations, it's important to get some of these topics onto the board agenda. And the reason why I say that is because when it comes to decision making and record keeping, it's not very typical for these types of things to be captured in the records if they're on an ad hoc basis. It's usually important that an agenda item is there, that board members have an opportunity to prepare themselves for whatever the agenda item is, or at least they have a certain openness to it. And then you can have concrete decisions that are made based on the agenda items that are put forward. Just remember, in many cases, there's limited time as well. So taking the approach of having something added to the board agenda and perhaps even leading that discussion is an excellent approach. Now, Doctor, are you monitoring the chat in terms of questions? I see there aren't any yet, but if for any reason you notice that I'm not paying attention to that, would you mind just giving me a heads up? I'd appreciate that.
No problem.
Okay, appreciate that. Okay, so that is the board level thinking. And just remember, as we go through this, the wide world view is basically the act of stepping at least 2 levels back from how you would normally look at an issue, right? So in practical terms, if I'm thinking about something that's affecting my neighborhood, then I should really be thinking about what's happening in my city, and I should be thinking about what's happening in my province for a Canadian perspective. Because whatever is happening in your neighborhood hardly happens in isolation. And I can tell you that if someone were to propose an exception to that rule, it would be quite rare indeed. So we'll now move on to the executive scenarios, what we call the the C-suite. I just got to make sure that yes, okay, we've got advancing. All right. So on the executive level, it's a slightly different approach because it's right in the word. You are operationalizing strategy, but your accountability is to the board. And so the most important thing about that is not to just think specifically about implementing what is laid out in terms of the strategy, but trying to understand what are the priorities that are driving the strategy that the board is developing. And what that does is it puts you in a position where you become a trusted partner of these board members, particularly the chair. So if it's possible to think about putting things in place by implementing strategically as opposed to simply fulfilling marching orders, you will show that you have a mindset that really contributes to the overall value, growth, and development of your organization. And that's very attractive to senior leadership. So specifically speaking, if it is possible to develop an intellectual connection with the CEO, who, by the way, is often the chairperson of the board, what that does is it allows you to take away some of the weight and some of the barriers that are associated with having to interact with people in strictly formal decision-making environments. We need to realize that a lot of decisions are actually made outside of the formal situation. We have the impression that that's when the decision is made. That's generally just when the decisions are confirmed. And so the influence that we need to exert is not just at the time of the meeting, it's in advance of those meetings where we can put certain ideas in the minds of decision makers, and that would follow naturally that they would then formalize those decisions in a meeting environment. I always think about how to address what keeps your superiors or your colleagues up at night. Now, medicine is always a good way to demonstrate this example, right? So if you have a particular ailment, the approach is often just to address the symptoms or whatever the pain is that is being caused. But often we don't realize that by addressing the symptoms, we're not actually addressing the problem, which means that the problem is often left even to get worse. And so when you think about what keeps the executive leadership team up at night, it's important to consider what the true origin of those issues may be. They may be internal to the organization, but often there may be some cause that's coming from outside the organization, which is exerting a negative influence on how things work. Now, to follow from the previous slide or the previous bullet on connecting with the CEO, it's very important, not only in formal scenarios, but in informal and organic situations, to draw attention to these key issues. And remember, and this is why I've written it here, drawing attention to a more important issue if it becomes apparent to you. Sometimes we stay up at night for the wrong reasons. That's also possible. Sometimes our worries are not targeted correctly. So we need to consider the fact that as part of the discussion on what keeps us up at night, we have to allow for the possibility that we may, in fact, have misidentified the real problem that we need to address as an organization. Then following from that type of conversation and that type of connection that we've built, we can then move to developing actionable proposals or decisions which clearly demonstrate the benefit of a wider perspective. Now, the reason why I put in the parentheses about showing the cost of a lack of perspective is because depending on who you're speaking with, some people like to hear about the carrot and some people like to hear about the stick. And in my experience, when you're dealing, for example, with a CFO, they can generally really appreciate when you can show them the cost of not doing whatever it is that you're proposing. You know, particularly in this volatile economic environment, there's a certain level of risk averse attitude in the C-suite. And so if you can show that you are de-risking the organization, that's going to automatically be an attractive proposal. So just be mindful that it's not always about speaking about positive. Avoiding negative or mitigating negative can also be just as powerful. Check with the doctor. Did we have any questions or points made up to now?
Not as yet.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so we're moving down in the organization, just trying to make sure that we cover again every stage of one's career. So the last thing, and this actually moves into the next category as well, is to focus on ideas which are scalable across the organization. So just remember that when you're dealing with the C-suite, they're generally not going to be that interested in specific initiatives in specific or isolated areas of the organization. They're looking for things or ideas, high value ideas that can be replicated or scaled up across the organization. So it's much more worthwhile to focus on those types of ideas and developing some sort of ramp where these ideas can gain investment or gain support across many leaders in the organization, or specifically through whatever strategic decisions that the CEO is making. So scalability is also very important. Now we'll move into the next level, which is the management level. A lot of us spend most of our career at this level, in fact, and it can be quite a challenge because of the fact that you're sandwiched between some of the executive pressures and a lot of the blowback that comes from the operational level. So, you know, we always speak about the curse of middle management and so on. That's well known in business circles. And so managing that for us as individuals is an art. It's absolutely an art because you have to manage equally up as you have to manage down. So how do we go about that using the wider worldview? Again, just using the general principle of stepping one or two steps back so that we have that wider perspective. So let's start with this. We need to seek to understand the strategic reasons driving the C-suite's decisions. And I know that when there is so much to do, there's a temptation to skip this part, but I find it's really important to invest a bit of time to understand the strategic reasoning around decisions, because what we hear from the managers community quite often is, oh, the C-suite has unreasonable expectations about this, or the C-suite is completely disconnected with respect to what they're asking us to do. And so if we can understand what the C-suite is trying to accomplish strategically, then we can place it in a more appropriate context, right? Because they're being paid to deliver on a particular strategy, whether we like it or not. So if we can understand that strategic concept, it will also allow us to assess our place in the organization more accurately. But here's the interesting thing. We do have power at the management level, and the power that we have at this level can be best demonstrated by being proactive in providing leading indicator-driven feedback to your superiors. Now, again, the terminology is quite precise there, but in simpler terms, all that means is we should have a certain role as a canary in the coal mine. If we're able to take indicators, data, or even anecdotal information, which is relevant to the C-suite's decision-making, we should be the first to indicate to them, drop them a note, drop them a line and say, we're starting to implement this particular initiative based on the strategy, and we're seeing that there are some issues here or there, or we're seeing some risks that may not have been considered. Now, it may not technically be our place, or we may think that it's not technically our place to provide that sort of input, and we're just supposed to do what we're asked. But I will tell you that in the long term, your value in the organization will be much more readily acknowledged if you're seen as the person who can identify issues and bring them up in a timely fashion so that the organization can make the appropriate pivots. So being proactive is massive. And again, you don't have to be an extrovert to speak up, because there are many ways to speak up. It can be informally, it can be through sending a note, it can be through emails, it can be use whatever tools that you have at your disposal to keep those channels of communication open. Be sure to ask questions about the context, to ask questions about the competition, and ask questions that go beyond just the data that's in front of you. One of the temptations that I see, particularly at the management level, is that there's a tendency to base everything on whatever the data feed is giving or providing. So you look at your dashboard, okay, I have this indicator, I have that indicator, so I'm monitoring my progress, and this is how it is. But the fact is, there is generally a lot of qualitative information that plays a part in the way that we operate, and it plays a part in the way that strategy is crafted. And so the C-suite is obviously always going to have a certain demand with respect to numbers and tracking and performance, but it's important to include some context and understand the competitive landscape. And if you can demonstrate that, once again, you become a trusted partner of the senior leadership team. And when you become a trusted partner of the senior leadership team, that's one step closer to actually becoming a part of the senior leadership team. So we'll move now down into the operational or support level, or what we would call ground level, rubber hits the road level. And at this level, again, there is a task-oriented approach to things. It's about executing on very specific deliverables. There tends to be a certain narrowness of function. But I would say that the most important thing to do if you're at this level in the organization is to demonstrate commitment to the task at hand. You may very well not like what you're being asked to do, but if you can demonstrate commitment to whatever it is that you're being asked to do, you put yourself in a position to be able to inquire as to how best you can maximize results as a member of your team. This is basically the ultimate in team player, right? Because you're not just thinking about your team mates, but you're thinking about what the team is doing in the context of the organization, in the context of what your manager is trying to achieve, and in the context of whatever pressures or risks that your manager faces. And that will always be highly appreciated. Following on to that level of commitment and inquiry, you should offer support and ask open questions. And this is a recurring theme, ask open questions, because it's the open questions that allow you to gain that organic understanding of the pressures that your manager faces. So if you have an opportunity to speak with a manager in your organization, you don't have to focus so much on the very specific numbers that are out there. It would be good to gain an understanding with respect to what it is that concerns them, and perhaps even to try to address some of the feelings of powerlessness that exist in the management team. And so if they have someone that is working in their team that they know has a certain level of concern and understanding for how the management team sees things, you will once again prove that your value is well beyond whatever it is that they're currently paying you, if that's how you want to measure it. Here we go, visualization. Picture yourself as your manager's manager, your manager's supervisor, and think about how in that position you would support your team of managers. And why do I say that? Because one of the often forgotten aspects of management is supporting the team in a tangible and sustainable way. Which means, how do you address the concerns that your team has, whether it is on a personal level, whether it's on a health level, whatever the concerns are, the higher up you get in the organization, the more influence you have on how the system of the organization can address those issues. So when you think of yourself as a manager supervisor, you're starting to think about how can your organization address some of the risks that arise from whatever adversities the team faces. And what it does is it eliminates that disconnect between what the objectives are and what is realistically achievable. And when I say realistically, I also mean sustainably, because in this world of quarterly numbers and quarterly objectives, in many cases, we compromise our long-term health or sustainability in the interests of hitting a target in the short term. So it's very important to understand or to breed a certain level of understanding in terms of balancing what needs to be done now and what needs to be done later. Doctor, how are we doing on questions?
We're still waiting for questions, but I think we'll ask folks again closer to the end.
Wonderful. Okay. So I've just addressed the business side of things, and I did want to take the opportunity to address a couple of other areas as well. The educational scenario, I believe, is also very important. The reason being that a lot of the ideas that we work with or that we toy with or that we research in our educational lives actually carry over, because the attitude that we have toward knowledge happens in an educational scenario, but it actually plays out in our careers. So that's why I thought it was important for us to invest a little on that side of things. So the first thing perhaps to point out is, do not be afraid to take a contrarian view. And I point this out keeping the issues and challenges of racialized communities in mind, because I know that there are many groups who are reticent to express views that are in any way clashing or conflicting with whatever the organization is doing. And there needs to be a realization in many cases that many of the systems and policies in place are, if not the product of some sort of systemic discrimination, they're often a product of some form of negligence as well, where certain things are not taken into account, perhaps because they're outside of the comfort zone of the decision makers, or because there's a certain level of ignorance. And as we know, for certain individuals, there is no compelling reason for them to come out of that area. So it's important for us, being armed with knowledge and information, to take a contrarian view if that's what needs to be done. I'm mindful of the fact that we have perhaps a higher level of fear when it comes to reprisals and so on, but when we see the larger context, which is to say that our career is most certainly not defined by whatever organization we happen to belong to at this point, then we can realize that the difference that we make doesn't have to be just in that organization, but rather we might move into a situation that's more appropriate for the positions that we're taking. Now, if you're going to take a contrarian view, it is important to understand that a contrarian view requires significant evidence. We speak about this in terms of the burden of proof, right? The way that things are done, people just assume that the way something is done is valid, is in order, and should be continued. So there's a certain inertia that exists in terms of the way things are done, which means that if you want to shift the needle, if you want to move things, you need to, and we spoke about this in previous slides, you need to do research. You need to substantiate your claims. It's not good enough for you to simply say, oh, yes, it's not like that. Oh, the policy doesn't address the issues. Okay, you need to understand what the issues are and what the effect is of not addressing whatever that issue is. You need to support your contrarian view, because that is the only way that you'll have any chance of continuing that conversation, even informally. Otherwise, you'll just have people who will shut down. Now, in an educational scenario, I think what is important is to engage with the academic community, professors particularly, on the type of research that is of interest to them. What are the issues that they're dealing with? What are the burning questions that they want to answer? And the reason why I point that out is because in my experience in school, having engaged with a lot of professors, I've found that what they're teaching isn't always a very good reflection of what they're actually interested in intellectually and academically. They may be in a particular circumstance where they have a certain skill set that they've been hired for, but that doesn't necessarily reflect where they're at in their mind or where their values are. And so if you engage with professors on that, that may even allow you to target your own output or your own research to be more relevant to what that particular institution is looking at. And it's just another way for you to add value. And so what I also suggest in that same vein is to casually research or casually survey what your student colleagues are curious about, and select from those topics when you're doing presentations or papers or even group work. Because then you know that it's going to be something that resonates in that community, and that it'll be addressing issues that people would actually want to implement changes in. So that's the educational side, really just having that wider perspective and looking a little bit further around you with that peripheral vision, you know, the 170, 180 degree vision, as opposed to what's right in front of you. And the fact that you have to write 25 pages and you're not sure what to write about, it really helps if you have this type of context. It helps you generate appropriate content. Now, the wide world view, how does that apply to our mobility or our portability? So let's look at travel scenarios. And I know there are a lot of cliches about how to be a good traveler and so on. And I think the Instagram generation has had a certain influence on our attitudes concerning travel. So I'm not going to address that angle much, if at all, but I do have a few ideas with respect to how we can make the most of our travel experiences by employing a wide world view. So the first one is I know, the doctor spoke about a lot of languages that I speak and everything else. And I do acknowledge that that is an advantage in many ways. But what I also discovered by spending time in countries where I cannot speak the language or where I have not had the opportunity to meaningfully learn the language, there are still ways to establish meaningful connections in those communities. So I tend to say, particularly to younger people, I say, don't focus on what you think you're missing in terms of those skills. Oh, I'm going to visit a certain country. I don't have the level of Spanish, or I don't have the level of German. No, if you're not able to do that, don't let that be a deterrent in terms of gaining something from the experience. And so my first suggestion is to seek to learn 3 key local facts that could stimulate a lively conversation. Because remember, if you're going somewhere, you want to be able to listen as much as possible to the views on the ground, the sensitivities, the concerns, the controversies, and so on. And the best way to do that is to just gain some basic knowledge with respect to the local issues at hand. And then you can ask some questions, not by expressing that you have knowledge, but by expressing informed interest. And by doing that, you exponentially increase the chance that you'll have meaningful interactions with people in these destinations. Don't be afraid to research controversial topics and demonstrate interest by asking open questions, and the operative word is open. We're not there to have people confirm things by yes or no. We want them to open up and lead us on a journey that we could never have planned for ourselves. And so the only caution that I tend to provide is it's important to research the red lines in certain cultures. And I'll give you a specific one. When you go to Thailand, Thailand is a monarchy, and there are some rules. They're called lèse majesté rules. These are rules that state that it's punishable by imprisonment for you to in any way insult the royal family or the royal institution. So when you're doing your research, you need to realize that there are certain types of questions that you would need to be very careful about asking, or there's certain statements that you would need to be very careful about making. So that's what I speak about in terms of legal or other sensitivities. It's important to be mindful of those. And once again, don't be afraid to ask people about some of those sensitivities. Even if they don't open up to you about every single one, you will learn something about their lived experience from the lens of those sensitivities. Now, maybe this is my acknowledgement of the TripAdvisor generation. I know that there's a tendency often, and since we read Lonely Planet and all of those types of things when we're researching a trip, we often tend to gravitate to the best of, the 10 best restaurants or the 10 best attractions or the 10 best, which basically oversimplifies the experience. Because there are a lot of factors that are not really captured in those lists. And I mean, I know why those lists exist, but we need to understand what the limitations of those are. So instead of lazily following some list or copying whatever we saw on the Food Network, my suggestion is to ask in the local context about the processes and art forms surrounding local cuisine, local gastronomy, and not just cuisine. Obviously, there are many other elements of culture. Cuisine is a very attractive one for most, and so it's a great place to start because we all need to eat at least a few times a day, and that's generally what we do when we travel. Now, the reason why I point this out is because when you ask these questions openly, what you will often see is that the individual you're speaking with will light up and wax poetic about the virtues of any particular thing that you've probably never heard of. And before you know it, you might end up in some place or restaurant or even a household where you can experience the authentic aspects of the culture, as opposed to always having a guided tour where in many cases everything is staged and everything is expensive and so on. So if you want to have an authentic cultural experience, the best way is to engage with people who do not have a vested interest in supporting whatever the is that you may have signed up for. I see. I will address this question in a moment. I'm just going to wrap up on the travel piece, and just a minute here. I'll just close this for a minute. So I see there's, all right, so we're on the general tips now. So I do have the opportunity to speak about the question that was asked. So Jean-Baptiste is asking a question on my diplomatic experience. And the question is, since I have a business background, what are the entrepreneurial skills that I've used to be a great diplomat during my international career? Or vice versa, I guess, the diplomatic skills that I'm using in my business activities? That's a fantastic question, Jean-Baptiste. So yes, my business background put me into a management track when it came to my diplomatic career, which meant that my responsibilities were mainly to keep our embassies, Canadian embassies, operating abroad. So that means security considerations, that means operational finance, HR, property, duty of care, and so on. Now, the entrepreneurial skills had to do with being in an environment that's not perceived as competitive, but in fact, it can be competitive. In the government scenario, we tend to think, oh, we have our budgets and they're predefined and you don't really have to work very hard for that. But what I've discovered is that if you want to make any real progress in terms of the areas you're responsible for, in terms of attracting additional resources to address long-standing issues, you need to have an entrepreneurial mindset in terms of developing business cases, assessing risks. You're basically doing your business school SWOT analysis and developing strategies based on that information, and basically mobilizing and motivating teams that may not necessarily be used to that approach. So yes, the entrepreneurial skills absolutely apply when you're going into the property market, for example, to acquire housing for diplomats. You need to realize that you have some disadvantages in terms of how fast your process is and so on. And you need to take that into account when you're negotiating with potential sellers or landlords. And so, yes, the entrepreneurial mindset absolutely does help, because you can understand what the concerns are of the other party, because most of the time you're dealing with people who have a business mindset, right? You're trying to support businesses, or you're trying to secure services from businesses. So you need to understand how they work, so that you can be mindful of the win-win or the mutual benefit that can be derived from that relationship. And so on the other side of things, when you speak of the diplomatic skills that you're using in business activities, it's really about seeing the other perspective. When you go to a country and you ask open questions, one of the advantages that you have is they reveal what is important to them. The same way that you want your values to be out there and you want to express something and people understand what your agenda is, it's very important for you to understand what the other party's view is. And so from a business perspective, if you're aware of the sort of risks or pressures that they're facing, then you're able to develop a discourse that will be more relevant to them and will massively increase the business opportunities that you can engage with them on. And so in my consultancy, that's very relevant, right? Where I'm able to have these conversations which can tangibly address their perspectives or where they come from or what it is that informs their decision-making processes or strategies or structures. Does that answer your question, Jean-Baptiste? I suppose you can just post a confirmation if you have the opportunity to do so. Now I'll just speak quickly about general tips. General tips in terms of the mindset is to never miss an opportunity to ask an open question. Never miss an opportunity to ask an open question. And why do I say that? Because when you ask an open question, there's very little downside to it. When you ask an open question, you decrease the risk of putting somebody against the wall, because they can answer a question however they like. That's the best part about an open question. Obviously, if you want them to be specific, you can ask your open question in a particularly crafted way, but it allows you to obtain more honest and natural answers from people. Just think about when you're filling out a form or a questionnaire. When you have these closed questions, it creates a feeling of defensiveness. And so when you want to eliminate that, you can do that by asking open questions and being forthcoming as well from your side about the issues that matter. Now, I see another question here about how a startup can stand out in a competitive world. How a startup can stand out in the competitive world. Now, of course, that's a general question, and in my consultancy, I deal with some of the specifics of that type of question. But in terms of standing out, I think it's very important, again, not to look at things from a high. I'm not saying a hyperlocal perspective is not useful, but it's not useful in isolation. It's really important as a startup, particularly if you have plans for growth, to understand that whatever it is that's happening in your initial phase should be amenable to growth, expansion, or replication, or even franchising, if that's where you want to go. So if you're looking to stand out, the first thing to do is to develop a strategy that would allow you to do that. And then you can decide from a branding perspective, what aspect of your skill or your team or your resources can then be used to create value as that startup. So it's not always just about the competition. I will suggest that if you have a fantastic idea, in many cases, it's going to be about the execution. And when you're able to demonstrate that you execute, the marketing becomes easy because you're not crafting messages. The messages are already there for you to amplify. So that's my shorter answer with respect to how a startup can stand out, but obviously anyone who has an interest in speaking about that can contact me directly as well. And once again, if it's possible for you to confirm if your question has been addressed, then at least I know that I can close the loop on that. Now, the last piece that I just see another question has come through. All right. It's actually a comment. Thank you, Jeffrey, for your comment. It says, in my experience mentoring and training young professionals in the 25 to 30-year age bracket, I find there is a fear of asking questions or engaging in discussions. One factor being the social media backlash. Yes, I acknowledge that, although I do feel that we've gone a little too far on to the other side in terms of the fear of backlash. I would state that when we are engaging in discussions, and we know that in a social media context, sometimes civility is not always at the level we would desire and so on, but it's very important to remember that if we have done our homework and we have research, that we should really stick to the elements that are reflective of the research that we have done. I've noticed that a lot of the problems arise when we get stuck on the opinion aspect of what is being discussed. And we tend to go there very quickly. So we'll present an issue and we'll have an opinion, or people say, well, what's your opinion on that? And my approach tends to be, I want to present what is out there, what I've seen first, so that the opinion becomes secondary. It's not necessarily even a question of my opinion versus your opinion. It is, what are we going to do with this information, and how is it going to help us grow, or how is it going to help us in terms of supporting whatever values that we're trying to promote? I know this is not always what you hear among young people, but it's very important to hold the line on that. And remember, obviously, that because a lot of this information is captured in a social media context, it basically means that it can't be erased. So we need to avoid the temptation of getting too heavily into the personal aspects of the issues that we're discussing. Now, the last piece that I wanted to speak about is weaving diversity into the conversation. Now, you might have noticed that I did not specifically address the matter of diversity in my prepared presentation, and there's a reason for that. And the reason is that what we're trying to do should be competent and visionary in and of itself. Now, do we want to remember the issues of diversity? Absolutely. If we're in an organization and we see that there are issues with respect to representation or equity or inclusion or belonging or all of those, we will absolutely want to have that informing our actions or our strategies or our plans in the organization. But we need to make sure that we use the level of rigor and commitment that I have spoken about in this presentation. And what do I mean by that? In the business world, diversity is often treated just as, another topic. Well, there might be profit potential, or there may be a question of risk mitigation. But when you look at the commitment to the values supporting diversity, that's often not there. So we need to have the conversation on several different levels. And we need to also acknowledge the fact that just because we put an idea in front of someone doesn't necessarily mean that they've adopted the set of values supporting those ideas. So we need to understand that this is a long-term thing, and that we at times may absolutely need to oppose or express concerns about things that are going on, but we also need to show ourselves immensely competent and committed in whatever situation we find ourselves in. And you notice that in the operational level slide, I spoke about demonstrating a commitment to the task and so on. This has to permeate across our career. We need to be regarded as people who have a serious commitment to truth, a serious commitment to facts, a serious commitment to integrity and so on, which will just work to increase our credibility when we get into discussions surrounding values. So that basically means that, if you're hired into a company, we can't unrealistically expect that whatever issues we have on our heart will immediately be addressed, and we should be comfortable about that. The fact is that we will be uncomfortable. The fact is we will face situations that are difficult. And so it's important for us to address that. I see that we're running out of time, so I will wrap up by saying that I am available to discuss with anyone who has issues in terms of business strategy or their global positioning, or even in terms of their approach to education, whatever the case may be. I'll post that information to the page so that I can be contacted and that we can further these discussions and support the community at large. So thank you again, everyone. I hope that you had the opportunity to think about some of these key issues, and I wish you the best as you go on in your careers.
Awesome. Thank you so much for a very informative and contextualized presentation. There was a lot of information there. I see folks in the chat saying thank you. Just note, everyone that has joined today, if you do want to go back to this, we will be posting it next week on our website. So you'll get an email with the replay as well as a worksheet. So all of the information that's on the slide, Ray provided it to us, and it'll be in worksheet form. You'll be able to access that as well. I just want to say thank you to the audience for joining us today. And Ray, thank you again. And we hope to see the rest of you next month. Take care, everyone.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.